Good morning from Sacred Space at Titania's Realm. It's 10:41 a.m. on the 15th of March 2025. Beware the Ides of March. If you know your history, the Ides of March was when Brutus Aurelius stabbed Caesar. Well, it wasn't just him, it was a few of them actually. But anyway, forever after that date, the 15th of March is forever memorialised as a day to beware of treachery, being stabbed in the front and in the back. Nasty it was. But anyway, some days and even in my personal life or in the collective, carry a certain energy and a certain almost repetitive pattern that gets reverberated through time, depending how much emotional charge is attached to it. For example, September 11, 2001 left quite a huge reverberating charge in the collective consciousness and in the timelines, space-time continuum. The collective shock of seeing those towers coming down, actually measured on the Richter scale right across the world. The emotion of everyone witnessing that on television and through the computers. So it's astonishing how powerful our human minds really are. We underestimate ourselves greatly as a species, and it's a great shame. If we would only channel all that energy into co-creating a safer planet and an abundant, peaceful, prosperous, for everyone, thriving planet, we could have the most amazing world. But instead we channel all our energy and money into human trafficking and drug abuse and wars and economic collapse and all sorts of shenanigans. One that happened recently 5 years ago we can bring into mention as well. It's a multi-pronged attack, worse than any spike protein. So hard to stay sane in the membrane, knowing what I know about our world, but I've always known it, and the survival of child sexual abuse and ongoing cumulative pernicious systemic abuses as well, and bullying in schools and at university and in workplaces, but I'm not a victim. I'm a survivor and a thriver. So I didn't go dancing last night. Didn't feel all that particularly right. And I still don't feel all that particularly well, but I may go this evening. I'll see how I feel. It's raining at the moment. It started out the most beautiful, glorious morning, but then it decided to rain and get all murky. Anyway, I need to nurture myself because no one else is going to do it. So I may dance, or I may stay home and just nurture myself. Sometimes dancing is nurturing though, getting out all that energy that's pent up and goes nowhere, and just put it out to the cosmos and let the music just heal and float all the ugliness and negativity away. It's very cathartic at times. So I do kind of need that because I haven't been dancing for a few weekends. 2 weekends. No, last weekend I missed out. Only 1 weekend. Goodness. Oh, only 1 weekend and falling apart at the seams. Oh well, it just shows you how important dancing is for my body, mind and spirit. But anyway, I'm not dancing. It's still fairly reasonably early-ish in the morning, now nearly 11:15. So I thought I'll read stories to you because that too is soothing for my nervous system just to, read delightful stories, and gives me something else to think about, take my mind off my other worries, which are enormous at times, very overwhelming, and live my best life as I do every day in every way in service to the gods. Sweet, isn't it? Anyway, today's story is called The Moon and Loopy Downtail. The poltergeist in God's candlestick could not rest. He'd watched and watched as God fashioned the perfect creatures, and they really were perfect. Even the most horrifying ones like anglerfish, lamprey, giant Medusa jellyfish, no matter how ghastly, they were still somehow wonderfully perfect. They made Poltergeist want to weep and laugh and writhe all at the same time. They were so perfect. If only he could make something like that, something so perfect. Finally, he knew he would have to have another go. His efforts so far had all gone wrong in one way or another. What he needed to do, he felt, was to let his fingers imitate God's fingers exactly. He needed to follow him exactly in every move he made as he created a creature. But how could Poltergeist do that without God seeing him? And if God were ever to see him, well, there was simply no telling what he would do. Probably cram him into a blazing star and hurl him into outer space. Also, he needed something more. It wasn't good enough just to imitate. Inspiration, that's what I need, cried Poltergeist. But where could he get that? Where could a poltergeist find inspiration? They seem to find plenty of bloody inspiration in my house, although to be fair, they've been quiet lately. I appreciate it when they're quiet. They were very unsettled and creating havoc leading up to Charlie's death, so I think they were trying to warn me and prepare me, and I remained, unfortunately, rather oblivious. One night he was thinking of this after God had gone to bed. As he pondered, a white light slowly filled the workshop. It was the full moon, rising and looking in through the window. Poltergeist saw the great white disk reflected in God's mirror. He stared at that reflection. How brilliant and pure it was. Somehow it looked better in the mirror than it did in the sky. But then, as he stared at that great light in the mirror, it seemed to Poltergeist that he heard something, a voice. "Do it," said the voice. Do it? Thought Poltergeist. Do what? And whose voice is this anyway? Do it, said the voice again, and suddenly a dazzling idea came into Poltergeist's head. He stared at the moon's reflection. He suddenly saw how he could make a creature that would be exactly like God's. What a brainwave! He was so excited his candlestick wobbled on its shelf, but he forced himself to wait. Yes, he would do it. The very next chance, he would do it. Thank you very much, Mystery Voice, he said to the moon's reflection. Seeming to smile, the moon rose slowly past the top edge of the mirror, and the workshop became dark. That next day, man came to God asking for a friend. But I've already given you woman, said God in surprise. Delightful woman, and you've also got baby. I thought you were happy. Oh, no complaints, said man. It's just that when I'm away in the forest sometimes, I don't know how it is, I get an eerie feeling. Eerie? Queried God. I know, man went on. The world is a wonderful place. A wonderful, wonderful place. I wouldn't have it one bit different. But it's also, well, a bit spooky at times. Spooky? Murmured God, fingering his beard. I wonder what you mean. You know, said man, I'd like somebody along with me, a happy little friend, so I could say, come on, let's be off. Or, did you hear that? Or maybe, why don't you go and have a look behind that bush? Said God. I see. A trusty companion. Whatever you think would do the job, said man. God thought for a moment, then said, I'll tell you what. You have a go. Come on, just make the friend you want, and I'll breathe life into it. But I can't make things, cried man. Oh, yes, you can, said God. You've never tried, but I'll show you. Just do as I say. And he hoisted a big ball of fresh clay onto his workbench. Now first, said God, do this. And so he began to show man how easy it was to shape an animal. All you did was imagine it, then fill up the shape of the thought with clay. Man suddenly had a vivid picture in his head of the friend he wanted. He laughed with excitement as God guided his hands. Poltergeist watched closely as man's fingers, guided by God, worked the clay. He felt intensely jealous. If God could teach man, why couldn't he teach Poltergeist? Still, in its way, this was a perfect lesson. Man was learning, and as man learned, Poltergeist too tried to learn. Poltergeist could soon see this was going to be a very pretty creature indeed. Lovely slender legs, a lovely bright face with a long, very sweet snout and brown eyes. Really startling brown eyes, almost golden eyes. And a grand tail sweeping upwards, bushy. God showed man how to take particular care with the teeth, the toenails, and getting the angles of the ears just right. They worked on it through the whole day. Evening came, and at last the creature seemed to be all but finished. God stroked it, making its fur glisten. Then God set it on the floor and turned it this way and that. He was thinking, because of man, I've put far more care into this than into anything else for quite a while. I want it to be absolutely perfect. And I think that's it. I really think there's no more to be done except for the life. Now Poltergeist knew his moment had come. He had to move fast. Once God breathed life into this creature, it would be too late. God would send it off with man, and Poltergeist might never see it again. He might never get another chance to do what he planned to do. So he hurled himself into action. With a terrific scream like 1,000 elephants, he tore a wide circle through the forest around God's home. "Fire!" he screamed. "Fire! Fire!" God looked up. The leaping flames reflected in his eyes. So sudden, he hadn't even smelt the smoke. He dashed out where the poltergeist scream was being taken up by the real elephants, along with the screams of the leopards, the monkeys, the cockatoos. All the creatures of the forest were yelling at the top of their voices, "Help! Help! Fire!" God set to work, beating out the fire with the palms of his broad hands, occasionally clapping his hands in the clouds to bring out the downpouring rains. And the rains did come down. Even so, it was touch and go as he coughed and choked, reeling in the clouds of sparks and rolling smoke, while the trees exploded around him like soft bombs, and man bounded home through the forest to warn his wife and get their belongings together, ready to flee to safety if the fire began to blow that way. All this time, man's finished but still unliving companion stood in the middle of the workshop floor like a stuffed animal, gazing at nothing, with bright golden eyes, waiting for life. Poltergeist sat up on the windowsill, peering at the shaking red mane of the great fire. Now and again, when it looked as though God might be getting the upper hand, Poltergeist shot out and with another tremendous scream blazed a new roaring and popping and cracking and crashing sway the flames into some untouched part of the jungle. So God laboured, fighting the conflagration till past midnight. Finally, he stamped out the last spark. The rain stopped and the sky cleared. The last reddish billowings of smoke blew off the full moon, which now hung over the scorched forest, tremendously bright and round. It was so bright, it threw God's shadow blackly ahead of him as he trudged home. Aching, he flopped into his bath. Wearily, he crawled into bed. It was only then, as his head sank into the pillow, that he remembered the bright, ready creature on his workshop floor, waiting for its breath of life. He smiled. "Tomorrow's a new day," he murmured, and was already asleep, just as Poltergeist had planned. The workshop was dark, except for the shaft of brilliant moonlight that came in through the window. Poltergeist did not want to light candles. God might see the glow in the crack of space at the bottom of his bedroom door. Poltergeist had a better idea for lighting up what he wanted to do. Pausing only to listen for God's steady breathing, he lifted the big mirror off the wall and propped it, leaning nearly upright, against the nose of the new, wonderful but still lifeless creature, which now stared with unseeing eyes at its double in the mirror. It looked as if it were sniffing at the nose of its own image in the mirror. But the strangest thing was, Poltergeist had so positioned the mirror that the full moon shone behind the creature's image, reflected in the glass. Its black pricking ears were silhouetted against the moon. It looked to be wearing a bright silver halo, a dazzling halo. With the help of the bright moonlight, Poltergeist began to work fast. He pulled out a good-sized lump of clay from beneath God's workbench and simply filled in that reflected shape in the mirror. This had been his great brainwave, and it worked. All he had to do was pack the clay into that perfect reflection, like clay into a mould. It sounds complicated, but for a poltergeist it was the easiest thing. Because it was so easy, he could work very fast. The moon rose swiftly from behind the creature's ears, but it still had not passed out of the top of the mirror when Poltergeist had finished. He gave his creation one last close inspection, checking every hair. Then he lifted away the mirror from between the creature that man had made with God's help and the creature he himself had made by the light of the moon. And there the two creatures stood, facing each other, nose to nose, exactly alike, drenched in moonlight. It was then that Poltergeist saw his only mistake. Because he'd leaned the mirror against the nose end of the creature made by God and man, the two creatures were not merely nose to nose, they were actually joined at the nose. Poltergeist examined the noses. There was no sign of a join. One nose simply grew into the other. There was no doubt about it. He'd made a funny sort of mistake here. He stared and stared at the single nose of the double creature. What could he do? Time was passing. Dawn would be here soon, and God would probably choose this day to get up early. What could be done? But he was still thinking when the bedroom door swung open and God strolled into the workshop, yawning and stretching. With a click, Poltergeist was back in his candlestick, and God gazed down, bemused at first, then puzzled, then baffled, then outraged at the 8-legged monster, the strange double creature that stared at itself with 4 eyes. "What?" he shouted, incredulous. His first thought was that he must have sleepwalked. Somehow, he thought, I came out here and I did this in my sleep. How else could it have happened? He couldn't think of any other explanation. He laughed then and scratched his head. Maybe, he thought, maybe I did just that. What a peculiar business. Suddenly he was filled with curiosity. What if he gave this oddity life? How would it manage? Still not properly awake, he kneeled down and looked under the joined noses. The chins were separate, but just touching, just kissing. He pulled them gently down, and with a single breath blew life into both the open mouths at the same time. But even as he sat back, he knew he'd made an error. The 4 eyes of the double creature rolled wildly. They stared at each other in dismay over the joined noses, then stared sideways at God, and the eyes seemed to be saying, "What's this? This can't be right. What's happened?" Their up-curling bushy tails waved uneasily, and they whined softly. At that very moment, man appeared in the doorway. "Just in time," said God. "I've just finished your new friend." Man stared, licked his lips, blinked and stared again. Maybe God would explain it to him. "Are you sure it's right?" he said at last. "What do you mean, am I sure?" cried God. "Did you ever see such a pretty beast? Such pretty legs and ears and eyes, such a gorgeous fur. Look at its ruff, and what a tail, one of the finest ever tails." "2 of them," corrected man. God frowned. "Try it," he said sternly. "Give it a chance." Man looked carefully at the joined noses, and now the 2 beasts rolled their eyes sideways, looking at him. They couldn't bend their heads because their noses had no joint. It was just as if the nose bone went from between the eyes of one to between the eyes of the other. "Take it," urged God. "You might be surprised." But the creature could not move. If one had walked forwards, the other would have had to walk backwards. And how many creatures do you see walking backwards? So this creature stood and swivelled its eyes towards God, then towards man, then back to God, and whined again. "Pick it up," said God. "Show it you love it." And so man picked up the double beast, one in the crook of each arm, with the joined noses over his head, and carried it home. Woman gave a short, sharp laugh when he set it down in front of her. Then she stared at it. "Is it a piece of furniture?" she asked. Man simply sighed and went on gazing at the 8-legged freak. "I know!" cried woman suddenly, laying her finger in the middle of the long connecting nose. "Chop it through here, then we'll have 2 for 1, one for you and one for me. Get the axe." The 4 eyes jerked wildly this way and that way between man and woman, then stared at the finger. First the nose, now the axe. Man carried the creature back to God and explained woman's idea. It's a risky thing, said God, to interfere with creation. I'll do it, but we might be sorry. It might cause trouble. Oh, said Man, what's a bit more trouble? And so, with his thumbnail, God nipped through the middle of the long nose that the two creatures shared. With a yelp, they leapt apart, shaking their heads and pawing at their snouts. God caught one of them, examined the raw nose end, then spat on it and rubbed it. The other whined and its tail drooped. Come on then, said God. You two, don't sulk. He did the same with that one. And the two creatures, exactly alike, stood there, quite separate, licking their noses. One of them gazed brightly at God and wagged its upturned tail. The other gazed sidelong at its partner. Its tail still drooped. It yawned, then licked its chops, blinked and gazed out through the doorway. Now, my dears, said God, that might have felt a bit painful, but I had to do it because I wanted to give you both very special noses. Very, very special noses. Now you both have the keenest sense of smell. You might well ask, why do we need this special sense of smell? Well, why do you need it? Do you know? God looked at them as if he expected them to answer. Uptail gazed at him boldly, his big ears angled forward, his eyes gold and bright. Uptail did not know. Downtail gazed at him with lowered head. His eyes were grey, not gold like Uptail's, and his eye pupils were tiny pinpoints of black. His ears moved, angling this way and that. He did not know either. He gazed at God, waiting for an answer. But as he waited, his ears never stopped listening to all the sounds of the world. Your special sense of smell, said God, is to lead you to your Maker. Nothing will really satisfy your nose except one thing, the smell of your Maker. Once a day you will have to lick the fingers of your Maker. Now away with you. Man was happy. Come on, boys, he cried. God called after him. Just remember, you don't have two creatures there. You have two halves of what was created as one. Halves can be very odd. Keep your eyes open. Man strode off, one creature leaping around him, jumping up to him, putting its forepaws on his chest, the other following a few paces behind, its nose and tail low to the ground, occasionally lifting its head and staring at flowers as if it heard sounds coming out of them. From the first moment, the two were quite different. There was no doubt which one was going to be man's companion. Uptail never left him. When he sat, it rested its chin on his knee and gazed up at him. Oh, I miss my dog Beauregard. I really do. When he walked, it walked just behind him, keeping its nose within inches of his knee. When he spoke to it, it laughed silently and dangled its tongue. Man was delighted. Fido, I'll call you, he said. Hey, Fido! And Fido yelped with excitement, seeming to bounce, then stood with its forepaws on Man's shoulders and gave his whole face a wash with 2 swipes of its big, wet tongue. Come on, cried Man, let's be off. And he strode away into the forest, with Fido bouncing beside him like a thing made of springs. Woman looked at Fido's partner. I suppose this one's mine, she was thinking. As she looked into its eyes, it lowered its head, lowered its ears, and glanced away. For some reason, she suddenly felt slightly afraid. The house seemed very silent. I'll have to make friends, she said. Come on, Loopy, she called in a sudden loud voice, and slapped her knee. To her horror, Loopy, as she called him, leapt up, its legs rigid, all its hair spikily on end, its ears flattened, and snarled into her face. Such a horrible, long, deep snarl that its whole body vibrated. Now, she chided. Don't you like your new name? Isn't Loopy quite a good name? And he should have been called Aristophanes. Something with a little bit more dignity. I'm with Loopy on that one. It's not nice to call someone Loopy. It's denigrating. I would have snarled too. And she reached her hand towards him. She knew she must not let him see she was afraid. She made her voice cheerful and soft. Come on, give me a lick, like Fido. But it made no difference. Loopy flattened to the floor, his whole face bunched up like a cloth being wrung out, and again he gave a crashing snarl. Then, with one leap, he was out through the door and gone. Woman ran to the door and bolted it. She sat down and looked at her hands, which were trembling. Well, she whispered, he didn't give me much chance to make friends with him. When Man came home and heard her story, he remembered God's words about the 2 halves. Meanwhile, Fido searched all over the house, busily sniffing at everything. Man thought, is he glad the other's gone, or does he miss him? Fido seemed to have read his thoughts. His tail swung in great circles. He squirmed his body and reared up at Man with whining yelps. He licked his face again, then licked his hands and fingers. Then across to Woman. Before she could stop him, he did the same to her, whimpering with happiness. He seemed to have his forelegs almost around her neck. Strange, thought Man, very strange. Fido certainly seemed happy. But out in the forest, Loopy was not happy at all. He wandered along, sometimes his nose to the ground, sometimes sniffing the wind. I'm looking for something, he was thinking. But what is it? Tirelessly he went on. After a while, he began to trot. Then he began to run. As he ran, 1,000 smells came drifting past his keen nose. But which is my maker, he thought. God said my nose would lead me to my maker. He ran on and on through the forest, then out on the ridges of the hills. Sometimes he stopped and sniffed and licked at a stone. Then he ran on. Night fell and he was still running. Later that night, as man's fire glowed red and the pot full of mushroom soup bubbled on the flames, Uptail Fido sat with his head on man's knee, gazing up at the sparks of red fire glow reflected in his eyes. When man spoke, Fido laughed silently, and when man fondled his head, Fido tried to tie his fingers in the slippery, loose knot of his tongue. But suddenly they heard a strange sound, a new sound. Man, woman, and Fido looked up. The round, full, bright moon now sailed directly above, a great white blaze in mid-heaven. The new sound seemed to come from the moon, or perhaps it echoed off the moon. High on a rocky hill above the forest sat Loopy Downtail. His nose, glistening with God's spittle, pointed at the moon. Out of his mouth came the new sound, the strange, wailing howl. The forest was motionless. No other creature made a sound. Were they all listening to this new noise among them? What was Loopy Downtail trying to say? Was he crying or singing? He seemed to be trying to talk. Man and woman could almost hear words and sentences in the ups and downs of that thin, far away howl. He seemed to be winding his voice round and round the moonlight. It made man think of the long tongue of his new companion, Fido, licking and winding round his fingers. But Fido did not like it at all. He growled a deep, angry growl. He did not like to see man and woman listening to that howl. He knew who was making it. He wanted to rush off into the forest and silence it. He wanted to chase Loopy Downtail away, right out of hearing. "Shh, Fido," said man. "Quiet, boy." Woman had stood up. She had turned away from the fire, facing the forest. "Eat your soup," said man. "It will go cold." But she went on, standing there. "Listen to it," she whispered. "Only listen." And there she stood, ignoring man and his new friend and his soup, simply listening to the long, wavering howl that seemed to be climbing and climbing towards the moon. The next story is called The Gambler. I was raised by gamblers, not nice people. Not just because of their gambling addiction, you understand, so we won't go into details, but not nice, not a pleasant childhood at all. God was making frog. He had almost finished. There it sat, green and yellow, with its front toes turned in, and its great golden eyes gazing from 2 bumps on top of its head. No fur, no feathers, no scales, just shiny, smooth skin, like wet plastic. God stared at the creature thoughtfully. It looked very bare. Maybe some feathers, he murmured, or short velvety fur like mole. That might be nice. But before he could give anything else to Frog, a shadow fell across the open doorway of his workshop. Man stood there, his face glowing with excitement. "Well, well, well," said God. "What a nice surprise. Any news from the great forest?" Man held out his 2 clenched fists in front of him, their backs upwards. He stared at God brightly. "Guess which holds the black pebble," he said. God smiled. Did man truly think he did not know? He saw the black pebble glowing darkly through the knuckles of man's left fist, and in his right fist, veiled with a faint pink, he could see a white pebble. "So what's this?" asked God. "Don't you see?" cried man. "It's a game. A woman invented it. She said, if you choose which fist holds the black pebble, I'll give you a kiss. And if you choose the white pebble, I'll give you a slap." "So what did you get?" asked God. 3 slaps. I got it wrong 3 times in a row." "A lot of fun, eh?" smiled God. "Pretty exciting," said man. "The 4th time I got a kiss." God laughed. "Well," he said, "and what if I get it wrong? What do I get? A slap?" Now it was man's turn to laugh, or at least his mouth laughed, his eyes stayed excited, bright and wild. "Well," he said, "you could give me power to create an animal, a living animal. How about that?" God became more interested. What sort of animal would man create, he wondered, if he had the power to do it? He would love to test him. Would he create a beautiful thing, or a gigantic monster, or what? "Very well," God said. "Let's say the black pebble is in that hand." And he tapped the hand that he knew held the white pebble. With a strange croaking shout of glee, man opened the fist and showed God the white pebble in it. "Wrong!" he yelled. "Give me the power." God pretended to look surprised. "Oh dear," he said, "what a good thing. I'm not going to get a slap. Yes, you've won the power. Use it wisely. Only one creature, remember. What a clever game." Man leapt from the workshop doorway onto the lawn. He stabbed both fists into the air. "I have the power to create," he yelled. "I won it." and he bounded into the forest, eager to tell woman that he had defeated God in her great new game, and that now he had the power to create a new creature. God smiled and turned to the frog. Excuse me. He was still thinking so hard about woman's strange invention that he forgot all about the extra trimmings he was going to give to Frog. He simply breathed life into it as it was, all bare-skinned and cold-looking. As Frog drew his first breath and looked out through his golden eyes for the first time, he croaked, "Which fist holds the black pebble?" and held his clenched fists up to God. God sat back and laughed. Somehow he had breathed the idea of woman's game into Frog. "But you haven't got a pebble," he said. "You can't play this game without pebbles." "Where are my pebbles?" cried Frog, staring at his empty palms. "Give me my pebbles so I can play." "You'll have to look in the river," said God. "That's where the pebbles are, all colours." "Where's the river?" cried Frog. "Quick, quick, I can't wait." God took him to the river. Frog plunged in and in no time came up with a black pebble in one hand and a glittering jewel in the other. He held out his fists. "Guess the black," he croaked. "And what if I get it wrong?" asked God. "We change places," cried Frog. "I become God and you become a frog." "And what if I get it right?" asked God. "I give you a kiss," said Frog. God laughed again and tapped the little green fist in which he could see the black pebble glowing through quite clearly, just as clearly as he could see the jewel glittering through the other one. Frog stared at the black pebble on his open palm. God had won. He shrugged. "Oh, well," he sighed. "It was a try," and he jumped back into the river. "Hey," called God, "what about my kiss? Come on, pay your debt. That's the law. If you win, you collect your winnings. If you lose, you pay. That's God's law." Frog surfaced and blew him a kiss. God went laughing back into his workshop. But Frog stared after him. A breeze rippled the river, and Frog felt suddenly very cold. Why did he feel so cold? He dived to the river bed and buried himself in soft silt, trying to find warmth. Frog soon realized that every creature had more than him. They all had either fur or feathers or scales or teeth or horns or tails. He had only his thin, smooth skin and no tail. Or they had beautiful voices, or loud, alarming voices, roars, bellowings, whinings, or clear, lovely song. Frog could only croak with a funny little gasping croak. Also the other creatures were nearly all wonderful movers. They could fly, or they could run. They could hurtle about in the bushes and the treetops, or over the stony ground. They could build nests among the spines or dash through the thorns. Frog couldn't do any of these things. He had not a single one of these useful ways. He could only crawl very slowly. He could swim, sure enough, but not like the fish that flashed through the water like bright thoughts and spun on a twinkle or vanished into pure speed. All he could do was swim from the bottom of the water up to the surface, and from the surface back down to the bottom. But that didn't seem like very much. God forgot to give me the extras, he muttered to himself. I don't have a single thing except what I look like. The other creatures have everything. It's God's fault that I'm so cold and have nothing. But then he thought about his black pebble and his jewel. Yes, he had those, and they were something. And suddenly, down there in the silt, he burst a tremendous bubble. It wobbled to the surface and burst there with a booming croak. Frog had just had a most fantastic brainwave. Quickly, he started to search among the river gravels. He had no difficulty in finding another black pebble. Another jewel took a bit more finding, but pretty soon he had one exactly like the first. Now he had two of each. He put them in the pouch under his chin. Crocodile was lying on a sandbank, imitating sleep, when suddenly Frog popped his eyes above the surface of the water, quite close to the great creature's nose. "Wakey, wakey!" cried Frog. "I've got a new game." Crocodile's first thought was, "What a plump little snack." But he pretended to be interested. "Oh, really?" he said. "What sort of game?" As he spoke, he moved his feet slightly, ready for a quick rush and a clashing snap. Frog held out his fists. "One of my hands holds a black pebble, the other holds a jewel." "Which holds the jewel? And what happens if I guess correctly?" asked Crocodile, shifting his chin slightly. "Well," said Frog, "you can eat me." "And what if I get it wrong?" "Obviously, you can't eat me," said Crocodile. "In that case," said Frog, "let's see. Eating me is pretty serious, so it has to be something to match. I'll tell you what, if you get it wrong, you give me all your fangs." Crocodile smiled. "Stupid little beast," he was thinking. "Right or wrong, you're my starters." But he said, "Okay, it's a deal. The black pebble is in your right hand." Frog opened his right hand, and there lay a jewel. "Your fangs are mine," he croaked, "and you have to pay up. It's God's law." To his absolute horror, Crocodile felt something like a zip fastener unzipping down either side of his jaws, top and bottom, and saw his teeth tumbling out on to the sand. Quick as lightning, Frog gathered them all up and stuffed them into his mouth. Crocodile saw them bulging in the baggy pouch under Frog's chin. Frog couldn't speak. His pouch and mouth were so crammed with Crocodile's fangs. They stuck out between his tightly closed lips at all angles. He gave Crocodile a big wave and dived out of sight. Crocodile let out a toothless roar of fury and flailed the sandbank with his immense jagged tail. Whumpity whack! But what could he do? He had lost the game, and his teeth were gone. He was astonished. He simply lay there and wept. Very soon after this, the great black-maned lion was drinking at the water's edge. He had just eaten an entire warthog, very salty, but he drank warily because he knew the river hid Crocodile with his sudden rush and his dreadful fangs. So Lion jumped back a yard when two golden eyes popped up a yard from his nose. He stared at the green, flat-mouthed face of Frog. "Who are you?" he growled. "I am Frog," croaked Frog, "and this river is my gambling casino. Do you want to play? Have you the courage to gamble?" "Play?" rumbled Lion. "Gamble? For what?" Frog held out his fists. "One of my fists holds a black pebble," he croaked, "and one holds a jewel. Guess which holds the jewel." "Why should I guess?" growled Lion. But then Frog began juggling the black pebble and the jewel from hand to hand very fast. Lion couldn't help staring at the flashing jewel. "Well," said Frog, "if you guess right, you get the jewel. You can keep it under your tongue, so when you roar, your mouth will flash with beauty, and all the animals, and the lionesses as well, will come closer to look." Lion blinked. Frog held his hands behind his back and wriggled his shoulders, then suddenly brought his fists forward. "Which?" he cried. "But what if I guess wrong?" purred Lion. "Oh, in that case," said Frog, "let's see. How much is this jewel worth?" "Quite a lot. I'll tell you what. If you guess wrong, you give me your roar and your mane." Lion laughed with surprise. He was thinking, "If I lose, I'll whack my great spread hooky paw down on that silly little head, and I'll simply take the jewel off him." "Okay," cried Frog. "Is it a deal?" "It's a deal," said Lion, "and the jewel is in your left hand." Frog opened his left hand, and there lay the black pebble. "You've lost," he croaked, "and both your roar and your mane are mine, and the loser must pay without fail. It's God's law." Then, to his horror and bewilderment, Lion felt his mane tearing off like a great Velcro collar. He tried to roar with rage, but to his worse horror, no sound came from his throat, only a dry whistle. And there stood Frog in the shallows of the river, packing the mane into a tight bale. Better luck next time, he roared, and Lion flattened his ears in the blast of sound from Frog's mouth, a blast of genuine lion roar out of that tiny mouth. Then Frog was gone, down to the bottom of the river. Lion staggered to the top of a nearby ridge and lay down. He was stunned. How had it happened so quickly? No mane and no roar. He covered his head with his great paws and let the tears seep down through the furry wrinkles of his great face. His chest was heaving with rage. But what could he do? He had lost. So Frog started his amazing career as a gambler. He challenged every animal. If you win, he would say, you can eat me. Or, if you win, you get this big jewel. No animal could resist. The forfeit for losing was always the thing they valued most. Their fur, or their speed, or their strength, or their tails, or their beautiful feathers. Elephant lost his trunk and his tusks and his great ears. Giraffe lost her superb tail and her thrilling jigsaw spots. Tiger lost his stripes, his leap, and the talons of his right front paw. Hummingbird lost her brilliant cloak of feathers and had to hop about like a tiny plucked chicken the size of a beetle. Cobra lost her fangs and Rattlesnake his rattle. Rhinoceros lost his horn, his sense of smell, and the toughness of his thorn-munching mouth. Weasel lost her dance and the whiteness of her belly. Porcupine lost her spines and Skunk her stink weapon and her gorgeous feathery black tail. Jaguar lost his black rosettes and the power of his green gaze. Macaw lost his fiery feathers and the beak that could crack a Brazil nut, and so on. Every animal lost their best possession to the cold-eyed, smiling frog. Frog stored all these winnings in a cave under the riverbank, and never once did he lose. Oh no, he was far too smart for that. How could he lose? What the animals did not know was that Frog was cheating. That had been his brainwave, how to cheat. That was why he collected 2 black pebbles and 2 jewels. When he said, "Which hand holds the black pebble?" both black pebbles were in his pouch, while his 2 fists each held a jewel. The guesser could not possibly win. Whichever hand he then chose for the black pebble always held a jewel, and when Frog said, Which hand holds the beautiful jewel I just showed you? He had already hidden both jewels in the pouch under his chin, and each of his fists held a black pebble. He was so nimble and swift with his hands, no animal ever saw him do the trick, and none of them ever suspected a trick. It was the first time any of them had ever gambled. They were all still so trusting. But what was Frog going to do with his winnings? His plan was simple. When he had won enough, he was going to go to God and gamble again with God, this time using his trick. Yes, he would cheat God. And the deal would be, when God lost, he would have to let Frog use and wear all his winnings as his very own whenever he wanted. So he would be able to stroll out in his porcupine armour, or he would leap across the plains like a gazelle, or he could shake down a tree load of ripe fruit with his elephant trunk, or he would always be warm, wrapped in his otter's pelt with its seal fur lining. But what about the animals who had lost? They were raging, weeping, wailing, whining. At first, they had been ashamed of losing their most precious possessions and had kept their losses secret. But soon they were telling each other. Frog had defeated them all. Frog was worse than a tyrant. He was taking everything from everybody with his two little green fists and his great, wide, green smile and his cold, golden eyes. The animals came to God. They told him about Frog's game. "You've made him too lucky," they cried. "He never, 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 never loses. He's taken everything we had." God listened gravely and nodded. Frog had certainly been busy. Finally, he said to them, "Go home quietly and leave it to me." As God sat on his veranda, thinking what to do about Frog, he saw a movement on his lawn. Frog was crawling slowly towards him. God waited as Frog heaved himself slowly up the steps and onto God's veranda, where he squatted, pulsing his chin pouch and gazing up at God through his brilliant eyes. "What's the news today?" asked God in a friendly voice. "How are you enjoying the river?" Frog's answer was to hold up his two fists. "The game," he croaked. "Remember? Let's have another round. I challenge you." God waited a moment, then said, "I'll tell you what. First we play your game, then we play mine. How about that?" Frog lowered his fists. He wasn't sure he liked the sound of that. "What's your game?" he asked. "Oh, you'll see," said God. "Quite exciting in its way. Let's play yours first. Then I'll show you mine." Frog showed God the jewel and the black pebble. Then he held his hands behind his back and fumbled there. Finally, he brought two fists forward. He had a special gambling voice. "Which hand holds the black pebble?" he cried. And if I win? Asked God. Whatever you like. I'll give you a kiss if you like, said Frog, and he laughed a croaky laugh. And if I lose? Asked God. Then you let me wear and use all my winnings as if they were my own, cried Frog, and his chin pouch pulsed. He knew this was the big moment. Also, he knew God could not win because both black pebbles were already in his mouth. His 2 fists held only the 2 jewels. God pondered and gazed at the little fists, pretending to think deeply. He could see quite clearly that neither fist held a black pebble. He could see both black pebbles lying together in Frog's chin pouch, like eggs in a nest. At last he said, I think I have it. Frog waited. His raised fists trembled slightly. What if God should see through his trick? But God reached out his forefinger and touched Frog's left fist. That one, he said. There's the black pebble. Frog opened his hand slowly and showed God the jewel. I'm afraid, God, he said solemnly, you've lost. God sighed and slapped his knees. Your luck, he said, is unbeatable. It's unbeatable. And are all my winnings now truly mine? Cried Frog eagerly. That was the deal. Yes, that was the deal, said God. They're yours, as if I'd given them to you when I made you. What a pity, though. This will be terrible news for the rest of the animals. They'll get used to it, cried Frog. When I had nothing at all, I nearly got used to it. And he turned to go. He had scrambled and flopped down a step or two when God said, Wait a minute. Now you have to play my game. Frog stared. Come on, said God. That was the deal. You can't possibly lose. You know that. You never lose. Frog wasn't so sure. He had never played anybody else's game. He heaved himself back up onto the veranda. He suddenly felt quite chilly. God was holding out both his open hands, palm upwards. On his right palm sat a tiny ball of clay. Frog looked at the clay. Is that your black pebble? He asked in a low voice. God chuckled. Yes, he said, in a way. Actually, I was thinking I'd give this to man to make his new creature. You remember how he won the game against me? He won the power to make a creature. I thought this might help him. And he chuckled again. What was God up to? Frog felt very uneasy. He licked his lips with his long tongue. Okay, he said, let's get it over. What do I win if I win? Well, said God, what would you like? God thought for a moment and licked his lips again. If I win, he said, you have to give me perfect luck, so that I never, never, never lose a game, no matter what, ever, ever. God raised his eyebrows. Very well, that will certainly be a huge prize. Why, you could gamble for the whole creation and everything in it. And win it, said Frog, with a broad smile. Okay, said God, it's a deal. Now, which hand holds the clay? And he simply turned his hands over, closing them as he did so. Frog was secretly overjoyed. God doesn't know how to play the game, he thought. He's forgotten to hide his hands behind his back while he juggles the clay about between them. But he pretended to think hard. By the way, arthritis. Ouch, says she who wants to go dancing this evening. I don't think I'll make it if I've got arthritis. But I've always pushed myself through. Where there's a will, there's a way, people of Earth. The Mama T can be very, very stoic. Let me just repeat that. Okay, said God, it's a deal. Now which hand holds the clay? He simply turned his hands over, closing them as he did so. Frog was secretly overjoyed. God doesn't know how to play the game, he thought. He's forgotten to hide his hands behind his back while he juggles the clay about between them. But he pretended to think hard. By the way, said Frog, you've forgotten to say what I have to pay if I lose. Frog was smiling to himself. He was so sure of winning. God really did seem not very clever. Oh goodness, how stupid I am, cried God. Well, yes, now let's think. Well, I'll tell you what. Everything you've won off all the animals, if you lose, you give it to me. That's not much to set against the whole creation, is it? I can't think of anything else. Frog frowned. For some reason, he felt confused. His head was whirling. He stared at God's fists. At least he knew which held the clay. So he didn't really have to bother about losing. How could he lose? It's a deal, he croaked, and the clay is in your left hand. God turned his left fist over and slowly opened it. Frog stared at the empty palm. Empty? Empty? How could it be empty? Where's the clay? He wailed, and his body seemed to freeze to a block of ice. Had he lost? Had he lost everything? All his winnings? No, no. God shook his head gently. I'm afraid, he said, you've lost. You've lost everything you ever won. Opening his right hand, God showed Frog the ball of clay. Frog's eyes had gone dry. He blinked them and licked them to wet them. Everything, he whispered, and he drooped. He seemed to sink into a little heap till his chin rested on the floor between his toes. His eyes were closed. I can't bear it, he whispered. The animals will eat me alive." He crouched there silent, but suddenly he moved. "Give me another chance," he cried. "One chance. Oh, please, God, one little chance. One more round." "Very well," said God, "but it will have to be my game." Frog nodded weakly. "Anything you say, God, but give me a chance." "Okay," said God. "This time the ball of clay gives you power to change yourself in a flash to whatever you want to be. So if you choose the clay, that's what you win." Frog stared greedily at the little ball of clay. His hopes perked up a little. "And this," said God, "is a hop." And opening his left hand, he showed him a tiny rose thorn. "A hop?" asked Frog. "What's a hop?" "You know," said God. "Hop, hop, hippity hop." Pretty useful in a tight corner. So even if you don't get the clay and the power to be anything you want. "I get the hop," whispered Frog. God nodded. "Now choose," he said, and he held out his two fists. Once again, he hadn't bothered to juggle the ball of clay and the rose thorn. Frog stared at the right fist, the one that had held the clay, but he wasn't going to be caught again this time. "The clay is in the left," he croaked. God opened his left hand and showed him the rose thorn. At that moment, a lion's roar shook the air. Elephant was trumpeting through his trunk. Hummingbird whizzed among the jacaranda flowers. The plains and the forests shook with joy as all the animals found their losses suddenly restored. Quickly, without another word, Frog hopped back towards the river. And God sat smiling, watching him go and listening to the joyful uproar of his creation. He tossed the two rose thorns onto the table and carefully took the tiny ball of clay out of his ear. "You can't beat God," he chuckled. So thus concludes today's readings. We've got five stories to go, but I need a rest, and I've enjoyed reading to you today. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and wherever you are in the space-time continuum, have a beautiful day. Time is currently 12:10 p.m. on the 15th of March, and it's been raining. The sun's come out to play, so happy days are here again. Blessed be, beautiful people of planet Earth, and I guess not so beautiful too. We can't all be beautiful, but we can be in a beautiful state of mind. And how does that song go? I'm in a New York state of mind. I like that song actually. Haven't listened to it for a long time. Billy Joel sings it, I believe. Well, Mama T's never been to New York. She's been stuck in Brisbane for 36 years. Actually, on the 1st of August, it will be 37 years. Time's marched on. I've been quite the prisoner of the Australian government. due to poverty issues and other people's evil and malfeasances. So, going nowhere fast, people of Earth. But at least I enjoy myself reading these stories and just looking up, admiring the little Indian myna birds that are up on the power line. Sweetness. So anyway, choose to be happy no matter what, no matter who, no matter where, no matter how. It's your divine right. Sometimes you have to drag yourself out of the abyss and you think of all the horror and ignominy and sadism and evil and cruelties, but there's still sunshine, birds and big white fluffy clouds. And exponential growth and new potentiates and love out in the world. Bye for now.